to the clap. Go. All right. Well, admit all. Well, welcome everyone to St. Thomas Church, Fifth Avenue, wherever you may be, whether in the third or the second dimension. It's an honor to be with you and share this time with you. I'm Matthew Moretz, the vicar here, and we have with us our special guest, Father Robin Ward, the principal of St. Stephen's House in Oxford, coming to us all the way from across those time zones, across time and space, to be with us here contemporaneously. How are you doing, Father?
I'm very well. My computer's just told me it's not charging, but I think I've worked it out. So that should be good. Excellent.
Wonderful.
Yes, we're all right. That's good. That would be very bad if we were to be cut off. I'm very well. I'm really pleased to be with you again this morning.
We are pleased.
And talk on the second of these three talks about the Oxford movement. So I'm in your hands. When you'd like me to start?
Yes, and thank you again for returning. And as you said, the second of three courses on the Oxford Apostles, the story of the Catholic revival in the Church of England, and the Anglican Communion. So without further ado, I'm going to make my way to my office, where I will be the administrator off site. So if you need a moment to answer questions, just give me a moment, Father, and I can run in here and help make that happen.
Sure, great. I want to start, actually, if I may, today by talking about somebody asked what I thought was a very perceptive question, sent it to me as an email. What is the relevance of these Oxford figures from 200 years ago in the light of our own church situation, the church situation of the Episcopal Church in the United States, the Church of England's situation, which is rather different, but of course we're all in one communion. What do they have to say to us today? And I think that such answer as one can give is to say that their importance, as is the importance of all historical study, is to understand the context in which we find ourselves. One of the things that I wanted to talk about when I began this series was to say to you, why is it that if you visit, I don't know, William and Mary College or somewhere like that, or rather old-fashioned churches in the original 13 colonies, that they look so different from what the worship and the architecture, etc., looks like at St. Thomas's, and that the reason for that is because of changes that happened in the way the church understood herself in the 19th century. But I think that as well as just simply putting where we are and our assumptions about what it means to be an Anglican Christian, assumptions like the Holy Communion service should be the normal Sunday service and so on and so forth, all of which comes out of the Oxford movement. So as well as understanding that historically, I think it's really important also that we understand how the force and power of the spiritual lives of these people actually should be an inspiration for us in the present day, which is actually what we talk about when we talk about we believe in the communion of saints. Because I think that the example of well, certainly the great heroes at the Oxford movement, Keble in his parish, Pusey, an educator, Newman, a great theologian for all ages in many ways, but also some of the less important figures, demonstrates that revival in the church comes from the spiritual commitment of those who are inspired by an idea and can carry it out. One of the things that I want to talk to you a little bit about this morning is the way in which the Tractarian movement encountered problems. And we often see in our own context, church life being very problematic. Everything seems to be going badly. I'm not saying this at St. Thomas's, but I think one of the issues that Western Christians have to contend with is this sense of discouragement. In the past, it all seemed so much easier and better and throve more and so on and so forth. And I think it's really important that the Tractarians demonstrate to us, both the commitment of labour that goes into reform and revival, but also the commitment of spiritual depth and spiritual commitment that these people had. So I think that that's very important as well. So I hope that for the person who asked the question, that's a sort of partial answer. And I might have another go at answering it when we get to the end of the series as well, when everything was sort of bedded down a bit. But that's where I wanted to begin today. So last week we ended in 1845. I talked about the way in which the Oxford movement, named after the city and the university where it happened, beginning with Keble's lecture in 1833, his address, the Assize Sermon, talking about the church in danger, and then concluding with the secession of Newman in 1845. And the classic period, if you like, of the Oxford movement is between those two dates, 1833 and 1845. Began with high hopes of restoring a proper understanding of the church's identity in the face of a secularizing government, of changes in church government that seemed to make the church establishment in England look much less impressive, the church being overtaken by liberal and progressive ideas. It ended with Newman becoming a Roman Catholic, and with many people considering that the teaching of the movement, as it was expressed in the tracts and as it was being reflected in the personal practice of many of the tractarians, inevitably pointed in the direction of Roman Catholicism, in particular Newman's Tract 90. And Newman left in 1845. With him went many of his closest disciples, and Newman also wrote a great book, the Essay on the Development of Christian Doctrine, which seemed to demonstrate that all of those things that members of the Church of England had considered to be Roman Catholic innovations, things like the cult of the Blessed Virgin Mary, the Eucharistic cult, those sorts of things, that all of those things could be demonstrated as true developments in the life of the church, and that the thing to do was to become a Roman Catholic and to submit to the universal church, rather than saying it was possible to have a Catholic church in England that was just really in communion with itself. And so Newman threw down a really fundamental challenge to those who were committed to Tractarian ideas when he left in 1845. And one can see, actually, I think, that since 1845, the successive crises that have confronted Catholicism as it's been practiced in the Anglican Communion have all been reworkings, if you like, of Newman's secession. A group of people say, we can't go any further with this. We need to be in communion with the Universal Catholic Church as they saw it, meaning the Latin Church in communion with the Pope. A few people become Orthodox, but not very many. But essentially what happens is that a crisis takes place, which tends to emphasize the more Protestant, reformed character of the Church of England, the Episcopal Church or whatever, and a group of people leave. But then others stay and others continue with the work, and so it continues. So in 1845, Newman went. A lot of people went with him, a lot of his closest followers, those whom he had influenced. But some people stayed. And most importantly, both Keble and Pusey did not become Roman Catholics. And if we're looking for the moment, if you like, in which the Tractarian Anglo-Catholic theology matured and showed that it wasn't going to go away, it's with Keble and Pusey's determination to stick it out. And they did so in circumstances that left them very isolated professionally, if you like. Keble went off was the vicar of Hursley, where he remained until he died in the 1860s. Pusey continued into the 1880s as the professor of Hebrew in Oxford, and lived in a very withdrawn way, but also a very embattled way. He was the writer, the controversialist. And they were joined by new people. They were joined by new people who had been influenced by their teaching and who spread the influence of the Oxford movement in a variety of different ways that showed that it wasn't going away. And we think in particular of people like James Moseley, who subsequently became Regius Professor of Divinity in Oxford in the 1870s. People like Charles Marriott, who had a very strong commitment to pastoral work and pastoral theology, who was the first principal of St. Stephen's House. Above all, Edward King, who was a founder of St. Stephen's House and who ended up as Bishop of Lincoln. He was the first bishop in the Church of England to wear a mitre. Whenever we think of bishops now, we always think of them as wearing mitres, but that was certainly not the case in the past, certainly not the case in England, that bishops wore mitres up until Edward King introduced that. and archbishops didn't wear mitres in England until about Cosmo Lang was the first one to wear one in about 1910. So many of the things that we associate with the way people should dress and do and behave in church were things that came in really during the period we're talking about now. Edward King was a very interesting person. He was the Regius Professor of Pastoral Theology at Oxford, then Bishop of Lincoln. He was very influenced by the pastoral revival in Europe at the time. There were bishops in Germany and bishops in France who were having to say to themselves, how are we going to reach modern people? What does the pastoral office mean now that we can't compel people, to come to church anymore? And King was a really interesting connection. He wasn't a great scholar, but he did know German and he did know French and he did know Italian, which many of the great scholars, didn't know as well as he did. And so he was able to write and preach and think and see what was actually going on in the ground in Europe, where very similar problems as were happening in England and in the United States were happening. That is, people were congregating in large industrial cities, largely untouched by the Christian faith and by Christian practice. In 1854, a bishop called Bishop Hamilton became Bishop of Salisbury in England, and he was the first bishop who identified with the Tractarians. Queen Victoria hated the Tractarian movement, really, and Hamilton only became a bishop because she hadn't noticed that he was a Tractarian. So we see that slowly and steadily, some of the bishops, and there were very few bishops in England then, I mean, there are about 120 of them now, and 5% of the population goes to church, whereas then a quarter of the population used to go to Church of England churches every Sunday, and we had about I think we had about 35 bishops. And so, it was a rather different time. Anyway, he became Bishop of Salisbury. So we see for the period immediately after Newman leaves, 1845, right up into the 1850s, what you might call a slow and quiet progression of Tractarian ideas, Tractarian principles, Tractarian spirituality, people going to confession, people valuing the church's liturgy, people coming to talk about the real presence in the Eucharist and so on and so forth in sermons. And that slow and steady progress is reflected in the progress of the movement across the board. Newman's departure doesn't kill it off. However, having said that, there are three really big crises, and these crises take place firstly in the 1850s, and then one continues into the 1870s, and these are three enormous shocks to Tractarianism, and they cause further secessions to Rome and further battles. On the whole, the Tractarians win most of their battles. But the first and the most significant one was the so-called Gorham Controversy, which took place in the early 1850s. The Gorham judgment was in 1851. Now, this was about the topic of baptismal regeneration. In the English prayer book, in the baptism office, the priest says to the child's parents and godparents, know that this child is regenerate. And so it was considered that the Church of England taught baptismal regeneration. That is, basically speaking, a person is given sanctifying grace when they're baptized and they become Christian when they're baptized. Now, lots of evangelicals didn't like that, and many English evangelicals used to have their children baptized by nonconformist ministers, even though they subsequently conformed to the Church of England, because they didn't like that phrase. Now, a Protestant-inclined anti-Tractarian clergyman called Gorham was instituted to a living a parish called Brampton Speke in the Diocese of Exeter in 1850, I think it was, 1849, 1850. And the bishop examined him on this doctrine, and he denied baptismal regeneration. And so consequently, the Bishop of Exeter, who was sympathetic to the Tractarians, although not one himself, refused to institute Gorham to the living. In the Church of England, the right to nominate parish priests does not belong to the bishop. Some bishops own that right themselves as the bishop, but there is a right of ecclesiastical patronage, which is a form of property, which means that a person can nominate a person to be the incumbent of a parish, which is why Gorham held out. Gorham went through the whole legal process and lost at every stage until the last stage. And the last stage, he took his case to the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council, which was a secular court, although there were some bishops who were assessors on it. And that court decided that he didn't have to believe in baptismal regeneration. He was instituted to the living by the Archbishop of Canterbury because the Bishop of Exeter wouldn't do it. And the Bishop of Exeter excommunicated the Archbishop of Canterbury. So it's quite a big row. But the most important part of this row was that various people decided that this meant that the doctrine of the Church of England was decided by the secular courts and Parliament and not by the Church as a living teaching institution with her own right to teach. And as a consequence of this, there was a succession of people to the Catholic Church, to the Roman Catholic Church, the most important of whom was Henry Manning, who was the Archdeacon of Chichester, and then was to go on to be the leader of the Roman Catholic community in England, Cardinal Manning, who was an opponent of Newman's, but also a great person with a great reputation for social work in England, but also a very, very hard line, what's called an ultramontane. He was one of the people who was most emphatic that the Pope should be declared infallible at the First Vatican Council in 1870. He was a widower. His wife had died while he was archdeacon, and it was only because he was a widower that he was able to become a Roman Catholic priest and subsequently archbishop and cardinal. But his secession in 1851 was very significant because he was very close to Gladstone, and Gladstone nearly left the Church of England as well at that point, but didn't do so. So that was the first and most difficult shock to the Tractarians when the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council decided that Gorham didn't have to believe in this key Tractarian doctrine, which they considered to be taught and demonstrated by the prayer book, that of baptismal regeneration. The second big shock came over Eucharistic doctrine. The Tractarians taught the doctrine of the real presence, that is, that the body and blood of Christ are truly present in the elements consecrated at the Eucharist. You'll know from your practice at St. Thomas's, where the Blessed Sacrament is reserved, where the host and chalice are elevated at the consecration during the Eucharistic prayer. You'll know that your own church in its practice, your own parish, teaches and shows and practices that Christ is truly present in the Eucharist as for our food, the bread of life. Protestant teaching tends to see the bread and wine as symbolic, roughly put. And so one of the key things that the Tractarians were very, very keen to emphasize was the reality of the Eucharistic presence. Keble preached about it, Pusey preached about it, but there was a significant legal case involving an archdeacon, the Archdeacon of Taunton, again, an archdeacon in the Diocese of Exeter. It's Taunton? No, Taunton's in Bath and Wells. Sorry, I've got that wrong. In which he was prosecuted for a series of sermons teaching the real presence. And it was not possible using that. Many of these Tractarians were very good at legal arguments, and so he went through all sorts of courts, and he lost, and he was told to be silenced, and he was deposed, and all of those sorts of things. But anyway, in the end, he won. So that was a significant victory for the Tractarians, that it wasn't possible to exclude teaching about the real presence. And this was really very fundamental because a lot of Protestant sentiment in England in particular saw the doctrine about the Mass the doctrine of the real presence and the Eucharistic sacrifice as being an absolutely fundamental mark of popery, if you like, of Roman Catholicism coming in through the back door. And in particular, this was associated with ritual things. And so when Denison in the end won his case, it gave a great encouragement to those who were minded to adopt Tractarian doctrine about the Eucharist, and particularly about the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. So they were encouraged by that. The third big row happened over confession and absolution. The first generation of Tractarians were very keen to revive the practice, which is clear in the Church of England Book of Common Prayer, about hearing confessions, about the priest hearing confessions and giving absolution. You'll know from your own parish that this is a practice that is valued and used and taught and is important to very many people in their spiritual lives. But in the Church of England in the 1850s, it was extremely rare and very controversial. Pusey started preaching about it in the 1840s. There were some parishes, Leeds Parish Church, which Pusey paid for, where confessions were advertised and heard, other places. But by the 1870s, it was becoming extremely controversial that the practice of confession was spreading so much. We see the magazine Punch, which was a great Victorian magazine, lots of cartoons in Punch implying that young priests were asking improper questions of women in the confessional. And then in 1877, one of the great Tractarian devotional societies for priests, the Society of the Holy Cross, published a book, a private book called The Priest in Absolution, which was really a manual for people who were hearing confessions. And this fell into the hands of enemies of the Tractarians, and there were questions asked in Parliament. One peer in the House of Lords suggested that capital punishment should be used for priests in the Church of England who heard confessions. And there was an enormous controversy, which in the end was resolved really by both the older and younger generations of the Tractarians coming together and essentially uniting to make sure that the practice of confession and absolution went on. So although the bishops and the archbishops were extremely anxious about the way in which this had been introduced into the church, and it was a practice for which most of them had no sympathy. Nevertheless, for spiritual and devotional reasons, it continued to grow and to prosper. And the row over the priest in absolution did not result in the destruction of what the prayer book asked. One consequence of it was that in the Church of Ireland, which was disestablished in 1868, in the Church of Ireland, the rubrics were changed and the form of absolution was changed as well, because in Ireland, for obvious reasons, the Anglicanism tends to have a more Protestant hue. Although even there were people who did hear confessions and make their confessions then as do now. So by about the end of this period that I'm talking about, going up until about the 1880s, the Tractarians really had established themselves. They had heroes. They had heroes in parishes, really devoted parish priests, people like Keble in Hursley. They had bishops who were sympathetic, Philpott, then Hamilton, and then others. They were having a great deal of influence outside England, in Scotland, in Wales, and in the Episcopal Church. We see Tractarian principles really begin to take off. We see places like Nashotah House founded with a very Tractarian ethos. We see colleges being founded, places like Cuddesdon and then later on St Stephen's House, to train clergy in a Tractarian fashion. We see people like Liddon and Church occupying pulpits in places like St. Paul's and having a tremendous national influence in England. And we see heroic ministry in the slums as well, very characteristic of Anglo-Catholicism. Father Stanton, who was curate of St. Albans, Holborn in London for 50 years. Father Dolling at St. Agatha's in Landport. Wonderful ministry with very simple people, very poor people. St. Peter's London Docks and Father Lauder and people like that. Father Wainwright. And we also see the revival of the religious life. I'm in the building in which the first convent, the first religious house for men since the Reformation was founded, the Society of St. John the Evangelist, founded in these buildings in 1865, still going, of course, the SSJ in Boston, even though it's finished in England, and also the religious life for women, which began in Portsmouth in 1841, and so monks and nuns returned to the Church of England as well. There was huge opposition to this. Lots of people thought this was terribly controversial, but in the end, the Tractarians were unstoppable. They persevered, they put up with persecutions, and the deep and attractive spiritual and devotional life of the movement moved them on and attracted those to come and support them and to make tremendous sacrifices, you know, for the sort of middle class and upper class women who became nuns in the 19th century. It was a real sacrifice. These were people who'd never ironed, never cooked, never done any of those things. And the men as well, the men here, the Cowley Fathers, you know, suddenly found themselves living in a way that brought them into much closer contact with what you might call ordinary people. And that was transformative in that way. So I'm going to stop there. Then after we've had time for some questions, we can talk a little bit, I'll talk a little bit about ritualism and the way in which that changed the public face, if you like, of Church of England worship. But I'll pause there for any questions.
I have a question, please. Can you hear me?
I can. You're a little faint.
You speak about legal questions, settling legal questions. In the Episcopal Church here now, we have a conference or convocation where questions are settled. How were these settled? Was it in Parliament? Was it a legal court? Was it a church court that those questions were answered?
That's an excellent and very perceptive question, for which I thank you. The reason that the Tractarians were not kicked out is because there was, and to be frank, is no effective means of doing so in the Church of England. We do now have a general synod, which is perhaps closer to your general convention, although it meets, you know, 3 times a year, whereas I know your convention doesn't. But up until 1970, the government of the Church of England had a sort of void in the middle, really. It wasn't possible. There were convocations, there were provincial synods, but they didn't meet. And it was actually one of the things that the Tractarians were keen to revive, was church self-government. And the convocations were revived in the 19th century, but Parliament was very reluctant to let them do anything. You know, they passed, you know, about 2 canons, mainly to do with, you know, minor things to do with the calendar or things like that. And the Church of England was still dependent on Parliament, you know, doing things like erecting new dioceses and so on and so forth. And because there was a strong nonconformist element in Parliament, and also because, which tended to unite with Protestant sentiment in the Church of England, you know, it became difficult to get ecclesiastical business through Parliament. And so one of the big issues for the Church of England as a national institution in the 19th century was finding the freedom to be able to do stuff. But a good consequence of that was that it was just almost impossible to get rid of anybody for anything. You know, both Denison and Gorham, from a different perspective, managed to prevail because they were able to get courts to, you know, to do. But nobody would ever, one of the things about the Church of England in particular is that nobody ever accepts an answer as final. And so people will always say, well, you know, I don't know, some of you, I don't know if people, I don't know if Monty Python is something that people watch in the United States, but if, some of you may recall the Black Knight in Monty Python in the Holy Grail, you know, has all his limbs chopped off by King Arthur and just keeps on saying, well, it's just a flesh wound. And in some ways, the Tractarians were similar to that in the Church of England. You know, no matter what happened, you know, they'd always say it's just a flesh wound. On we go, and that's one of the ways in which, you know, because we don't have the structures that you have. But having said that, of course, you know, one has to accept that actually, you know, in the United States, Tractarian principles made more progress than they did in nearly any other part of the Anglican Communion, other than those places that were evangelized in the British Empire by some of the high church mission societies, so for example, you know, Nigeria is largely low church Anglican because a particular low church missionary society, the CMS, evangelized Nigeria, whereas Ghana was evangelized by High Church Missionary Society, and so is much more Anglo-Catholic. And so in those places, Anglicanism is more monochrome. In Ireland, it is in Scotland, because Scotland has a Protestant established church. The Anglican Church in Scotland tends to be more Catholic, whereas, and the same case in Wales, in Ireland, where the Roman Catholic Church is predominant, at least in the south, the Church of Ireland has always tended to be more Protestant. So, but where the church is mixed, as I'm sure you'll know, I mean, there's the Great Beretta Belt, isn't there, in you know, Fond du Lac and Eau Claire and places like that, where you've got, you know, around Neshota up there in Wisconsin and Milwaukee and all of those places. Yeah, geography throws these things up, but that's a very good question. The short answer to which is that there is no answer to your question. Because there was no answer to your question, the Tractarians were just able to keep going, and no one was able to get rid of them.
We have a question from Anne Satterfield. She's raising her hand.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm intrigued by the term regeneration, baptismal regeneration. Would you please elaborate on that? And in particular, how does that compare to rebirth?
It means the same thing. So it means, basically speaking, it means that the Tractarians held that the prayer book office of public baptism taught that infants, when they were baptized, were regenerated. That is, they were delivered from being children of wrath, subject to original sin, to being redeemed, to being part of the body of Christ. Now all theologians accept, you know, the children who, you know, don't know, you know, one thing from another in their state of innocency are not the same as adults who have moral agency. But it was a fundamental tenet of Tractarianism and of Catholic theology more generally, that children are regenerate in baptism, that they become Christians when they are baptized. They are children of grace. For evangelicals who coming out of a Reformed Protestant tradition, the important thing is the personal acceptance of justification by faith, and also many evangelicals believe in final perseverance. That is, that you can't fall away from being a Christian in the end. And so the doctrine of baptismal regeneration is gall and wormwood to certain sorts of Reformed evangelical theology, which is why it was controversial.
Thank you. Is there anyone else in the room who has another question? Just checking. All right. And it looks like no one online. Do you have any? All right.
No,
yeah.
I've not got anything in the chat box or whatever it is. So I shall go on. I'll go on to talk a little bit about ritualism, which is one of the ways in which the Oxford movement most influenced the appearance of Anglicanism and the way in which the Anglican worship changed. Up until about 1850, Anglican worship was very simple and very Protestant. Clergy would wear surplices, There wouldn't be things like a cross or candles on the altar. There would be liturgical singing in cathedrals in England. The cope was worn as a vestment, but no new ones were made really after about 1670, 1680. And so many cathedrals gave up wearing copes when their old ones wore out or got very tatty. Incense was used in one cathedral to make it smell nicer right up until about 1760 at Ely. But one of the canons didn't like it, said it made him cough. We all know people who think that incense makes them cough. And so it stopped being used then. So we should think of the Church of England and the worship of the Episcopal Church indeed as well as being very plain, very simple, very reliant on the ear and on reading and hearing, rather than on anything visual, other than a very plain and austere visual environment. That's not to say a boring one or a lackluster one, but just a very plain and simple one. But as I said last week when I was talking about the Romantic Revival, the Middle Ages, continuity with the Middle Ages, with colour and with pomp and with the worship of the church as it had been in the Middle Ages, people began to see continuity rather than rupture between how the church had worshipped before the Reformation and how the church worshipped after the Reformation. Newman, Keble and Pusey were not that interested in the ritual revival. Keble was a bit. Newman, when he became a Roman Catholic, just accepted it all when he went over. But there were people in the Church of England associated with the first generation of Tractarians who were more interested in ritual revival, making altars out of stone, using lit candles, using the cross. And bit by bit, we begin to see change, particularly in the 1840s. We see in one or two places choirs wearing surplices and cassocks. We see Oxford churches, some churches in Oxford using candles during services, sometimes only in the evening, but we also see things like an altar cross and candles at Newman's Church at Littlemore. And we see also in one Oxford church, the Thomases, the incumbent stitched together two pieces of silk that were meant for academic wear, actually, and made Eucharistic vestments for the first time. You'll be familiar with the Eucharistic vestments as you have at St. Thomas's, the chasuble in particular, the vestment of the priest. These were not worn in the Church of England. But some people said that the Book of Common Prayer ordered in the Ordinance rubric, right at the very beginning, a little piece of text in italics, that the ministers should wear what the ministers wore in the second year of the reign of King Edward VI. And it is the case, King Edward VI having come to the throne in 1547, that in the second year of his reign, that is 1548, they did still wear the Eucharistic vestments. And so some people said, we can wear these Eucharistic vestments. But more than any teaching, more than any book, more than any pamphlet, seeing people dressed wearing the same robes as Roman Catholic priests to celebrate the Holy Communion service was a red rag to a bull. People would not have it. I was at worship this morning at the Queen has a small private chapel in Windsor Great Park. She's not there now; she's at Balmoral. But the Queen has a rather old-fashioned sort of low church piety, which comes largely from sort of German traditions, really, in the royal family. It's not an evangelical piety particularly; it's a low church piety, and the Queen doesn't have, I think, in any of her private chapels anyone wear Eucharistic vestments now. She prefers to keep to a rather more old-fashioned Anglican usage of surplice and stole. She's happy with the stole, but on the whole in the royal chapels, Eucharistic vestments are still not worn. So even now there's a little bit of old-fashioned concern about the use of those, although they've become much more general in the Church of England. But there are and were lots of people in Oxford, and in particular, two priests called Palmer, one at Magdalen and one at Worcester, who were interested in liturgical theology, were interested in looking at the sources of the liturgical books contained in the prayer, the liturgical texts contained in the Book of Common Prayer, where they came from. And there were also people who were interested in ritual, in the wearing of vestments, and so on and so forth. There was huge agitation against this, because what you see in church is always much more apparent, always much more controversial than what you listen to very often. And we know, for example, that in Exeter there were riots when the Bishop Philpott said, used to be the case in the Church of England that the minister would change out of the surplice into a gown to preach. When Bishop Philpott said, I'd like you all to preach in surplices, there were riots. And so in Exeter, there was a riot involving 5,000 people when the bishop gave the order that the surplice should be worn to preach sermons. It was a no popery riot. We're not having that. We see, however, that throughout the 1840s and 1850s, in a few parishes, never very many, a few hundreds, that ritual changes begin to come in to force. And we see more people using Eucharistic vestments, more people decorating churches with candles and crosses on altars. And we see a variety of legal actions that begin in an attempt to prevent Tractarians using these ritual things, all of which fail. And we see riots in churches in East London, St George's in the East in particular. We see the Tractarians who were interested in ritual brought down the number of ritual things they wanted to introduce to 6. And I never write these down, so I've got to try and remember what they are. The eastward-facing position when celebrating the Eucharist, lighted candles on the altar, the mixing of the chalice, putting water into the wine of the chalice, the use of unleavened bread, the use of the cross, and then there was one other. I always need to write it down next when I'm doing this. And those 6 points became the things that the Tractarians tried to introduce wherever they were. The government under Disraeli set up a court to try and prevent these practices under the Public Worship Regulation Act, which they'd passed. And although the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council at various points did allow these 6 points that the Tractarians were interested in, nevertheless, there was an enormous row in the mid-1870s over the 6 points, because the legislation that the government had passed, you can see how important this was in British public life. You know, Disraeli in the 1870s, he's dealing with German reunification, he's dealing with, you know, the colonial agenda, he's dealing with, you know, all of these things, and yet he has to give time to set up, by Act of Parliament, a new means of regulating ritual in the Church of England. He had a ritualist vicar where he lived in Beaconsfield, and who used to get up, used to get on his nerves by introducing these practices into his own parish church. But there were a succession of legal judgments about this. But what really made a difference is that many clergy went to prison rather than obey what the courts told them they could or couldn't do in church. In particular, a priest called Father Tooth. They went to prison for contempt of court. They didn't go to prison for huge lengths of time, but people were not prepared for their clergy to go to prison over ritual issues. And so in the end, after a period of really quite intense ritual persecution in the 1870s, ritual persecution really began to peter out after people said, look, sending people to prison is too much for this. We're not going to have that. There were ritual rows in the United States also, in some of the churches associated with the Tractarian movement. But the last real formal trial over ritual matters in England was in 1888, when Bishop King of Lincoln was arraigned before the provincial court of the Archbishop of Canterbury over ritual offences that he was alleged to have undertaken, use of unleavened bread, saying the Agnus Dei, things like that. And the Lincoln judgment on the whole went largely against Bishop King. Basically speaking, by 1890, the fight had gone out of those who wanted to suppress ritual practices in the Church of England. There were still relatively few churches that had things like vestments, certainly very few that had incense. But basically speaking, the sort of worship with which you'll be familiar in 20 minutes' time had made headway. And in England by the 1890s, the fight had gone out of those who wanted to stop the clergy wearing Eucharistic vestments, using unleavened bread, lighting candles on the altar when the candles weren't needed for light, and so on and so forth. With that, I finish.
All right. Well, Father, thank you so very much for joining us. Do we have another question or two we might have time? Catherine.
It's absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much. It's just, it's wonderful.
Thank you, Catherine. Yes, sir.
Might Father be willing to stick around a few minutes for those of us who have a couple of questions?
Well, there's no one to administer the machine if I leave. So, and it needs stewardship. So.
I'm really happy for people to ping me email questions, and then I can take them up when I begin next week. It's always a pleasure to have time to think about what people have drawn from the talks. So yeah, just do ping them to me.
Well, Father, I've sent you a picture to your email of the class that's gathered here. Because I can't turn the camera that's on the ceiling around to look at them. So you'll have a peek at who you're speaking to in 3 dimensions over here.
That's fantastic. Thank you for your attention.
All right. Well, thank you so very much, and we'll be seeing you next week.
Yeah, much looking forward to it. I'll be on holiday in Cornwall, so I'll be speaking to you from my mother's sitting room next week. So, but I look forward to seeing you all that.
All right. All the very best. Many blessings.
Thank you so much for your interest. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.